explosion of the 3 World Trade Center towers in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and a whole lot more. This is 9/11 Free Fall. I'm Bernie Suarez. I'm here with Andy Steele. We're coming to you on shortwave radio, courtesy WWCR. Hi, everybody, and welcome to 9/11 Free Fall. This is a program which is primarily committed to the scientific evidence surrounding the events of 9/11, exposing the official story of 9/11, and we are committed to bringing attention to an organization called Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. It is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the pursuit of academic truth with respect to the events of 9/11. Andy Steele, here we go again. Welcome to the show. It's nice to be here with you. How are you?
Oh, it's an honor to be on today's show. We got a really great guest coming up, and week after week we keep coming back because we know it's not a show, it's a fight. It's a fight to get the truth out and let Americans know what happened on that day.
That's right, and we like to always remind our audience, please go to AE911truth.org, AE911truth.org. Check out that organization. You want to stand for truth and stand solid on science and not on conspiracies with regard to this very important issue. Learn about architects and engineers and what they're doing. Go ahead and go there. There's a lot of options. You can click on the evidence page. You can decide to sign the petition to demand a true investigation of 9/11. You can take action. We talk about this every week. There's a lot of other features on that website, including frequently asked questions, which we've tapped into in the past. Okay. Well, I know over at Architects and Engineers, there's a lot going on. Anything new going on, Andy?
Well, the journey for truth continues, and we have our two great volunteers, Rena Patty and Pamela Senzi, are journeying across America to raise awareness about the scientific truth of 9/11. And if the audience wants to keep track of their progress, they can go to 911journeyfortruth.org. I always like to repeat it, 911journeyfortruth.org. And there's 2 blogs at this website. We have Rena's blog and Pam's blog. And you can follow, like I said, you can follow their progress, see where they're going, because they're keeping a diary of their journey. And, just to highlight one entry here, earlier in the week, or I believe it was, they went in, they visited a police station. So you can read about their account. And, from what Rena said when we talked to her earlier in the week, the station was very receptive to the information they were giving. Here we are 11 years after the event. A lot of the emotion has worn down, and that we can actually look at this with a more critical eye. Some of us more than others, but that's why it's important to get out and wake others up.
That's right. And for those of you who understand, just imagine, this is about at least some 2,000 plus miles, I would imagine, that they're embarking on. So I'm sure they'll be in good shape. And just imagine what they're doing, just putting it all on the line out there just to get this word out. So a lot of admiration goes out to those 2 ladies, as Pam Senzi and Rena Patty there. They're doing a lot. So we'll definitely be talking more about that as that journey continues. We like to kind of briefly recap. We've done a few things over the last few weeks. We'd like to throw out a question without spending too much time on the recap. We have been talking about how the the science in general is under attack, and we talked about the scientific dictatorship. We played some audio from Dwight Eisenhower, our president back from 1961, talking about the scientific dictatorship. And so we've been kind of talking about that, the pile driver theory, National Construction Safety Act. We mentioned a couple of the gentlemen that are out there fighting against the actual science of 9/11, Chris Moore and Dave Thomas. We'd like to point that out, but we're going to move forward, Andy, as you know, we've got an incredible guest here today, and we're going to be talking a lot today, a very, very exciting show today. So one of the things we're going to do now is what we do every week. We're going to go ahead and take about 10 seconds of silence just to commemorate the victims of 9/11 and their families. And we're back. So again, people, we do this every week just to remind ourselves. It keeps me focused on why we're doing this, Andy, and it hopefully reminds our audience that this is about the victims and their families. And if nothing else, of course, it's also about Americans in the world, humanity, and our quest for justice and transparency with regard to 9/11.
Well, you're absolutely right. And the victims and the victims of 9/11 weren't just the people who died on 9/11. It's the people in all parts of the world that have died as a result of the wars and everything that followed, and that continues to go on right now. So we remember them as well. At least I do in that 10 seconds.
That's right. So one other thing we do, we want to mention a quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed on this show do not necessarily represent the opinions and the positions of architects and engineers. We do promote the organization out of our own free will. We think that's a great organization that represents the science of 9/11, but our opinions, of course, do not necessarily represent the opinions of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. So throw that out there. So Andy, we're going to move forward. Last week, we throw a quick question out every week. This week's question is simple. For our audience, you want to answer this question, want to leave us a voice message, give us a call. That number is 510-292-4515. And this week's question is, if you believe the official story, what do you make of the fact that over 100 people at least testified they heard explosions in the World Trade Center? Some we're hopefully we'll get Graham McQueen on here, and there's his study that has showed over 118, and in some other studies even more individuals that heard and or saw explosions in the World Trade Center. So what do you make of that? If you believe the official story, what do you make of all these witnesses that were right there and they heard and or saw explosions? So that's our question for the week, 510-292-4515. You can always go to ae911truth.org and click the contact button and just put in the header 9/11 freefall, and we'll go ahead and get that, and we'll respond to that. Maybe we'll read that out on the air next time or something like that. Well, okay. Now, Andy, I'm very excited because our guest this week, where do I begin? If there is ever a person who has, as I describe it, pull out the chainsaw of truth and cutting through the deception of not only the NIST theories, but also the 9/11 narrative in general, and a lot of the disinformation about September 11th regarding the science of 9/11. This person is that person that has brought out the chainsaw of truth. And the work that this person has done has affected my life. I'm going to start by saying this gentleman is a registered professional engineer who graduated from the University of Connecticut with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. He became interested in the science of 9/11 in early 2008. And he has this has been one of his hobbies ever since. Now, he's written several short articles, book reviews, poems even. He's co-authored frequently asked questions for architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, and was a former board member of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. Now, he is featured in the new, a lot of his work is, let me digress. He is an expert witness in what was presented last year at the 10th anniversary, the Toronto hearings. He did contribute to that as a witness. His work is all over the internet. He's got some old work and some new work and a lot of videos. We've talked about his channel before. His YouTube channel is Physics and Reason. That channel, ladies and gentlemen, has collectively over 500,000 views and nearly 3,000 subscribers. So if you want to go out there and win arguments, this is the channel to tune into and appreciate the many experiments that are on here. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce Jonathan Cole. Jonathan, thank you for coming on the show. Welcome to 9/11 Freefall. Much love from all of us. It's great to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much, Bernie and Andy, to have me. It's a real honor to be on your show, in my opinion. It's a real pleasure.
Well, we really do appreciate you, Jonathan. Now, we've got a lot of materials. I know you have a lot of topics we asked you to talk about and you want to talk about, so let's get right to it. Go ahead and explain to it. Now, give us a little bit about your background, and I want for our audience listening in, Jonathan Cole, this man has really put together, essentially, tell us how you got into all this. Tell us about your background and how you got into 9/11, and tell us how you essentially, at least from from my eyes, you became the experiments guy. I mean, you're the go-to guy for a lot of these 9/11 experiments. You had something written on your YouTube channel. It was a comment that I read. I just captured a couple words, and it's had something to the effect of experiments, not words. A lot of people like to claim things with their words. You've done a lot of this with your experiments. Now, go ahead and take us from the beginning. Tell us about your background and how you got involved in 9/11 Truth.
Sure. Well, as you'd mentioned before, I am a civil engineer, and back in 2001, when I watched these events happen live on TV, of course, we were all shocked, and I was like everybody else in the world. I was on board for, hey, let's go get the guys who did this to us, and I never really thought much about what I watched on TV. As a matter of fact, one of my coworkers looked at me when those towers came down. He said, hey, can that really happen? And I said, geez, I don't know. I guess it just did. And I remember that day hearing about sounds of explosions, and I just sort of dismissed it and thought, well, the authorities will figure this out. They'll tell us what happened. Right. And then it sort of just dropped off my radar for many years. I did not immediately pick up on this. I think I was like most Americans. I just assumed that the authorities would do their job and take care of this, and we would find some real truth and justice and take care of it. Right. And that was really for many years, all the way up until the end of late 2007, December of 2007, okay, where somebody sent me a YouTube video. And it had to do with the rate of how fast those towers came down. And that got me into this, and I started studying more and more. And the more I studied, it was, like I say, one of those things, the more I looked and learned, the more I realized that what we were told could not have been true. And so I also started researching all the fantastic work that has been done by other independent scientists out there, and other researchers too, not even in the science field. Mm-hmm. We have some of the greats out there, the David Chandlers, the Tony Zamboti, Gordon Ross, Graham McQueen, Stephen Jones, and I started reading their papers and trying to understand kind of the science behind this thing. And I really wanted to just focus on the Twin Towers and, of course, Building 7. And I really didn't get into much of the Pentagon or the Shanksville thing. Mm-hmm. And I realized that I asked myself, so what can I do to help this out? What can I do to help out with this whole movement? And the one thing I thought maybe I could do was to take some of the work that was done by these other folks out there, some of the mathematical works proving what had to happen. I thought, well, maybe I can put some experiments together, and maybe I can kind of demonstrate what these other people are trying to say in their papers, because sometimes like a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes when you can see it yourself, you can grasp the concepts of what's going on there. Right. And so I started putting together my YouTube videos, and of course when I got into this, I'm just a civil engineer. I didn't know much about videography or even how to do a YouTube videos, and my early ones are a little bit rough around the edges, and you kind of get a little bit better at that as you go. But my first ones had to do with this whole concept of this crush down, crush up theory, which we'll probably touch on later, that was put together by Professor Bazant. But probably my first biggest one was one that I called the mysterious eutectic Steele. Mm-hmm. And that was basically to do an experiment, a relatively easy experiment, to either prove or disprove what we were being told for the steel that was found by Professor Jonathan Barnett of WPI, Worcester Polytech. Sure, right. And that steel was sulfided, or there was evidence of what's called a eutectic on it. He found this steel at Ground Zero, and I think it was actually part of it was to Building 7, and he reported on it in Appendix C of the FEMA report. And the big question at the time is, where did the sulfur come from to cause these eutectic formations? And it was never answered later on by NIST, but other independent folks did write papers to come up with an answer of where the sulfur came from. One of them was Dr. Frank Greening. He wrote a big paper on it, and that was picked up by many others that said, oh yeah, well the sulfur must have come from the gypsum drywall that's out there. And the BBC and all the experts on the BBC and the scientific programs that they put out, they also claimed that the that the sulfur came from the gypsum wallboard. And so I decided to do just a simple experiment. It seemed like a pretty straightforward experiment because I thought in my mind, gypsum wallboard, we use that all the time to protect steel. We don't use it to attack steel. And it didn't make sense to me that gypsum, the CaSO4 in gypsum would actually attack steel, but I wasn't sure. I'm not a chemist. I did read that there's different types of sulfur. There's sulfite and sulfate, and there's also elemental sulfur. And I've read that it's impossible for calcium sulfite or sulfate to turn into elemental sulfur for a bunch of chemical reasons. But I said, well, let's do an experiment. Let's find out if this could actually be true or not. Surely they did an experiment to prove this. Well, it turns out they didn't. So I took a piece of wide flange beam that I had around in my backyard, and I took some drywall sulfur, and I mixed it all together and crushed it up. You can watch the YouTube video, and I heated it up, and I collected a whole bunch of brush and all kinds of material that would burn. And I burned this stuff around a steel I-beam for quite a while, for actually several days. Took it all apart, and the experimental evidence is that, well, that sulfur that supposedly attacked that steel surely did not come from the drywall. So that was one of my bigger videos.
And I want to say, I've watched the video. It's incredible. Anyone, as I said, we said earlier, people can watch that experiment on the YouTube channel Physics and Reason, and individuals can also go to the website. Apparently, you started along with David Chandler, who we had on here a couple weeks ago, and that website is 911speakout.org, correct? All the experiments are available there, right?
They are, and actually David Chandler, it's really his website. He did invite me to put my videos on there, which he graciously did. So yeah, that's the easy place to get all of David Chandler's videos and my videos. It's www.911speakout.org, and there's a lot of good scientific information on that.
Exactly, and that makes it, it's like an all-star website with you get more than just one person's work all on one platform. So now I know that we can talk about, you've got incredible videos out there, the Mysterious Eutectic Steel. We hopefully we'll get plenty of time to talk about the one of my favorite videos of all time, the Newton versus NIST. You've got the Great Thermite Debate. You have the Expert versus Expert, which it's a must-watch. The humor and the intelligence and the short, concise nature of that video is incredible. But before we get into all that, I know, give us your take on 9/11. I know you wanted, we want to get your take. You have an analogy that you want to share, a Santa Claus analogy.
Sure. I look at 9/11. I kind of, when I've done some talks in front of some other folks out there, and I start off and I say, I want you to think back in your life, way back when we were all just children. We're 4 and we're 5 years old. Okay, the three of us are on the playground. Actually, there's a whole group of kids on the playground. And it's December, and guess what's coming up? Christmas. And all the kids are all happy and excited because we're all talking about what we're going to get from Santa Claus. And I come walking up to the group that's all excited, and I say, I don't think Santa exists. And the reason I don't think Santa exists is because I know that reindeers can't fly. And because reindeers can't fly, then the entire story falls apart. And they all sort of look at me and they say, well, that's totally ridiculous. For crying out loud, I've sat in Santa's lap. She sat in Santa's lap. What is he, an imposter or something? When I ask my parents, they say he's real. When you ask your parents, they say he's real. If you ask any adult anywhere, any 5-year-old asks an adult, they're going to say, of course he's real. Not only that, all the media talks about, we have Christmas stories and we have movies about Santa, and even NORAD tracks him on Christmas Eve. We can watch him as NORAD tracks him. So what are you telling me? What are you telling me? That do all the parents and all the authorities, the media and the government all have some sort of secret meetings and decide to lie to all us millions of kids? That would be impossible. Somebody would have talked. And besides, who would come up with such a scheme? And why would they do it? And so I tell all the other kids, I say, you know what? I can't answer the who and the how and why they would do it. I just don't know. But I do know that the laws of physics say that reindeers can't fly, and therefore the official story has got to be wrong. But all the other kids, of course, ignore me, and because what I have to say certainly isn't fun. It's kind of a downer. And because they believe that somebody would have talked trumps my physics of the reindeers flying. And so they say, well, I must just be a crazy conspiracy theorist, and I probably don't think we landed on the moon. And besides, even talking about this is sort of scary. So they just ignore me, and they laugh, and they go about their life having fun on the playground. And 9/11, in my opinion, is very similar to this analogy in that you can show people the science and you can show them the physics, but they just still use the, well, somebody would have taught response, or, well, that just can't be true because it goes against my beliefs. Your physics goes against my beliefs. So that's my little analogy that I use about 9/11.
Amazing. That's a great analogy. It's just amazing how that works. Obviously, in the analogy, there is no way to explain to the viewer and to the listener that the media is controlled and the messages are controlled. And but does remind us that there are messages out there that we as humanity, or a lot of us, we need to believe in order to maintain our current paradigms. So that is definitely a great example as kids maintain the paradigm, that hope that Santa Claus will show up the next year and the next year and all that. So that's great. We thank you for sharing that. Well, going back to your work, so it looks like now we've interviewed David Chandler, Wayne Koss, we've talked to David Schlesinger and others, that we've talked to here at the show and outside the show now, and everyone has a different way of going about how I remind people, I simply watched Loose Change around the same time back around in 2008, and someone showed me Loose Change about 5 years prior to that or something like that, maybe, or, years before that, 3, 4, 5 years, and I wouldn't look at it. I said, get out of here. I refused to watch Loose Change, and then I did, and kind of everything unraveled after that. In your case, it seems like that you're kind of the same thing. I did like you. I was assuming that the authorities would figure it out. Why should I have to figure it out? It's not my job. And you kind of let it go. And you didn't think much until you saw some evidence that a light bulb comes on, and with regard to the science. So we find that pattern quite often. So at what point do you decide now, or should I say the drywall, the gypsum, the mysterious protective film, is that your first experiment? And at what time do you decide to become the experiments guy? I mean, you already knew you were going to just run one experiment after another, or was it after the response to the gypsum drywall argument and the sulfur? What point do you realize you've got something really big going on?
Well, actually, that was not my first video. I did some earlier ones that basically demonstrated just the principles of this whole crush down, crush up thing. And again, there has been so many excellent papers on this thing. I was just trying to find a way to show people, to visualize what these science papers were being done. I mean, a lot of people don't understand fundamental calculus or fundamental physics, but when you show them something, then, well, that's, like I say, that's worth a million words. So I was trying to find just a small niche that I could fill that really wasn't being filled by a lot of other people out there to do experimental evidence based on the principles of physics that would apply to 9/11. So I really just started off thinking, well, I'll just do this one. And then I thought, then somebody who actually sent me the mysterious eutectic Steele was actually a friend of mine, emailed me. He says, hey, John, why don't you try this? And I thought, that's a good idea. And I thought, I could do that because I live on some acreage, and I grew up on a small farm, and I'm relatively handy. I can repair engines and weld, and I have torches and plasma cutters and all that. So I thought, I could do something like this. And so I just started, I made the decision to do that, and then it just sort of grew from there. And then I put one out about every 2 or 3 or 4 months about another idea that I might get for another experiment.
And for our audience, Jonathan Steele, now we were talking off the air. Now, so people can appreciate, you actually, tell us how you put these experiments together. Now, it's not just a walk in the park. You actually have to get the material. You have to have the space for it and the equipment. I mean, you're even mixing to prove the thermite in one of the experiments. You're actually putting together the components of it and mixing it right there in front of the camera. This is incredible stuff. You want to tell us about your equipment, or obviously does it require a lot of people involved helping you out, getting these resources together to make these experiments happen, or is it all you're doing it all yourself?
For the most part, I'm doing it myself. I did have a friend of mine help me run my front-end loader. I have a backhoe loader to help keep the fire fed and help lift up some of the steel on a mysterious eutectic steel. But it does take quite a bit of while. I have to think about how I want to put this together. For example, one of the videos called "The Great Thermite Debate," we may touch on later. That one took me about 3 months to put together because I had to think of how to get all this stuff and how to do these experiments and get the results, because actually my first experiment on that failed. And so I had to scratch my head thinking, well, how can we make this stuff work to do what everybody said it couldn't be done? And so it took some time. I did have to bring some steel to a machine shop and have it milled, and then had to drill and bolt and do some welding, like I say. So it does take a little bit of time, a little bit of setup, but it's nothing out of the ordinary. Anybody with some mechanical skills can certainly replicate what I've done there, and that's one of the keys about the experimental method. It's got to be repeatable by anybody.
Absolutely.
That's what experiments are all about.
That's right, and that's the reason I tossed that question out to you, so that our audience can appreciate. We're not talking about somebody with a little microscope and a couple test tubes in a little garage somewhere. We're talking you're really putting a lot of effort and getting the actual materials and the steel beams in that experiment, the Great Thermite Debate. And we'll talk about that experiment, but first, let's talk a little bit now. Andy and I, we had David Chandler on a couple weeks ago. We've been hammering away at Newton's laws, and let's talk to us a little bit about the experiment, Newton versus NIST. Now, as I said earlier, this is my favorite, or one of my favorite, if not my favorite video, but you've got so many other good ones, so I'm not sure which one's my favorite now, but this one's been my favorite for a long time. I believe in Newton's law. I understand it, and I've done a lot of work, just small mini demonstrations using little blocks at the street level. But please, you want to talk about that work with the Newton versus NIST? Tell us about that.
Sure. And it's a couple of videos that kind of tie together. One of my earlier ones was called Collapse versus Demolition, and then I call it Newton versus NIST. I don't know if it goes by NIST. I call it NIST. But and these were little experimental videos I put together that really, the credit really goes to guys like Tony Zambotti, Graham McQueen, who wrote The Missing Jolt, and of course David Chandler, who wrote Destruction of the World Trade Center, North Tower, and Fundamental Physics. The credit really goes to them, and they wrote mathematical papers saying what had to be based upon observations. And I tried to put it more of a hey, here's an experiment to show you what we're actually seeing with scales and things like that. But it's kind of it's a counterintuitive thing. And if you'll allow me, I'm going to go through a little bit here to hopefully try to explain it.
Please, yes.
Yeah, it's okay. Well, let's first just real briefly go over Newton's three laws. Everybody's heard of them. Everybody knows these laws. It's nothing. There's nothing high calculus here.
That's right. This is high school science right here.
This is high school science. Yeah, everybody knows this. And you've all heard these laws before. They're very basic. Newton's first law is a body in motion. I'm just going to generalize, by the way. A body in motion stays in motion, and a body at rest stays at rest, unless, of course, it's acted on by some outside force. So something just sitting there won't move, and something that's already moving will continue to move unless some other forces are there to slow it down or speed it up. That's his first law. Seems pretty obvious. His second law is, you've all heard it, F equals ma. Force is equal to mass times acceleration. And it's really, I like to emphasize that it's really not just force equals mass times acceleration. It's really the sum of all the forces acting on a body is equivalent to mass times acceleration. For example, you're sitting in a chair right now. There's a force with the chair pushing up and you pushing down, but you're not accelerating. It's the sum of all forces acting on that chair, which is both a down and an up. The sum is zero, so it doesn't accelerate. That's his second law. And then, of course, his third law is for every action there is an opposite and equal reaction. So what I did is, and I'm going to just kind of walk through this here, and we'll talk about the towers, and we'll talk about principles of physics of applying those three laws. We know that the majority of the damage, of course, where the planes hit and the fires were way up high on those towers, right? The floors above, and of course the lower portion of the tower was much larger, lower 80 or 90 floors, depends on which tower you're at. Those weren't damaged at all. And we know they weren't damaged because hundreds of people walked down those stairs to safety after the planes and the fires were going up there. We know they were perfectly strong and they could support that upper floor. Right. And that lower undamaged portion not only could support the weight of the top of the undamaged portion. We had the undamaged portion at the top, we had the damaged portion in between, and we had the undamaged portion below. But that lower tower was designed to support a lot more than just the dead weight of this upper portion of floors. It was designed to take hurricane loads with a fully occupied building. And those hurricane loads pushing on that column, on those perimeter columns, would handle up to maybe 4 or 5 times more than what the dead weight would be of just those of that upper block. So, and of course those steel columns were tapered all the way down to the ground, so they got stronger as one went down. Now, most believe that the fires heated up and weakened the steel columns in the areas where the fires were, where the plane hit. And then once the columns were heated up in that area, they couldn't support the upper weight anymore, and they sagged and they started bowing. And then that upper section of the tower smashed down and destroyed the lower part of the tower. That's sort of the common thought that we've been told here. And either the floors fell and hit pancake style, or the entire block came down and smashing down on the lower part. Now, NIST, by the way, never bothered to go any farther than going to the collapse initiation. In other words, when it just started to fall, and then they simply said, well, it was inevitable. It was just going to happen. Right. Well, let's carry this a little farther than what NIST did, and let's see what we actually observed there. Well, what does it mean when something actually smashes down? Well, according to the dictionary, if something smashes into something, it breaks something with a force, or to break something with a great force. You need a force, obviously, to smash something. Makes sense. Right. So for the towers, the only force that we're assuming that was available was the force of gravity. Gravity, by definition, is a force. We talk about the force of gravity, so gravity equals force. That's the only force we have to work with here. So how can we increase or amplify the force of gravity so it actually smashes something? Let's talk about the principle of a falling object. And I'm going to take an easy example. Let's take an ordinary egg, okay? Let's say that's a big egg, and it weighs, let's say, 1 pound, to make things easy. And an egg just sitting on your table can support itself, and it won't break. That's obvious. Let's say that this particular egg that we're talking about can actually support 2 more pounds on top of it, but anything more than that 2 pounds will break that egg. So just over 3 pounds of force will break the egg. If we pick that egg up high enough and drop that egg on a hard table, what happens? Well, it smashes once it hits the table, because the table can support so much more than one egg, and of course it breaks. That's obvious. But let's measure the motion of that egg very carefully to understand what happens from the moment we let it go from our hand to the moment it breaks. Okay, first, the downward force on the egg, and the only downward force, is from gravity. There's no other downward force on that egg. And when we hold it in our hand before we drop it, it's not moving. And the reason it's not moving, of course, is because the upward force is exactly equal to its downward weight. 1 pound up and 1 pound down. The forces acting on the egg is balanced. Or the sum of all forces on that egg is 0, right? If the sum of all forces is 0, that means there's no acceleration in accordance with Newton's second law. It cannot be accelerating because the forces are balanced. Okay, pretty obvious so far. And now we open our fingers. Now the upward force is now 0, and the downward force, of course, is always there. It's still 1 pound from the pull of gravity. So now the net force is negative 1 pound downward. What happens? Well, it accelerates down, and acceleration means it gets faster and faster and faster. The reason the egg accelerates is because now the system of forces, or the net force on that egg, is no longer balanced. And because there's no upward force at all, we say that it free falls down, okay? That's free fall. All right, pretty obvious still so far. Now, will the egg break as it's accelerating down? As it's falling, will it break? Well, no, it won't. It won't break. The egg cannot break as long as it's accelerating down. Now, and it can be at any downward acceleration, not just free fall. It still cannot break. It can be falling through, say, glycerin or water or something like that. It's slower than free fall, but it still won't break. Why won't it break? Well, because the upward force that was once supporting that has been reduced, and the constant downward gravitational force is now being used to accelerate that egg. Again, there's no other forces out there to break the egg as long as the egg is accelerating. And there's actually less force on the eggshell as it's accelerating downward than it was sitting on the table, because when it was sitting on the table, the lower part of that eggshell had a pound pushing on it. But now there's nothing pushing on it at all. So there's less force when you see the egg accelerating than when it was at rest. Okay, so far so good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's say that we have an invisible hand, and we can reach out and we can support that egg as it's falling, and we apply, let's say, a half a pound upward of force. So we have 1 pound pulling it down and a half a pound pushing it up. So now the net force on the egg is now a half a pound down. 1 down, a half up means 1/2 going down. What happens now? Since the downward force on that egg is half, the egg cannot continue to accelerate at free fall anymore. But the egg's downward velocity still increases, but now it's at half the rate of free fall acceleration, or half the acceleration of gravity, but it's still going to accelerate. Okay, now let's increase our upward force to the weight of the egg, or 1 pound up. So now we have 1 pound up and 1 pound down. What happens now? Now the net force on that egg is 0, 1 down, 1 up. Does the egg still accelerate? No. The egg does not accelerate because all forces are balanced. There's no net force acting on the egg. So what happens to its downward velocity? It's downward. Does it slow down, speed up? What happens? It stays the same, because Newton's first law says that a body in motion stays in motion with balanced forces. So it doesn't speed up and it doesn't decrease. It holds at whatever velocity that we applied the 1 pound up. It was falling the instant we applied that 1 pound up. Make sense so far?
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's apply 2 pounds upward. What happens to the egg? It decelerates at a rate of 1g. The egg is pulling 1g, if you will. So now it's going to decelerate if we have 2 pounds up and 1 down. 3 pounds up and 1 down, same thing. It would decelerate at a rate of 2g until it comes to 0 downward velocity, and then it would actually push it back upward like bouncing a ball at the rate of 2g, but this time upward. Okay, the point of all this is that whenever one changes the total net force on an object, it instantaneously changes the rate of acceleration, automatically, instantly. So, if there's any change whatsoever to the net force acting on any object in motion, especially a downward falling object, but any object in motion, there's an immediate change in the object's acceleration rate. So here's the key. The opposite is also true. If you observe an object, and you don't know what the forces are on it, but if you observe an object change its acceleration rate, you can be sure that there was a new force applied to that object. Mm-hmm. And so the rate of deceleration will determine the total force on the object. The slower the rate of deceleration, the less the upward force or jolt is on that thing. This is why an egg won't break when it's dropped into a very soft pillow, but it will break when it's dropped on a desk. When it's dropped in a down pillow, the rate of deceleration, or the G-force, is less than what the eggshell can support, and therefore it won't break. But when we drop it on a desk, the G-force is very large, and it breaks the egg. Okay, let's apply this to the towers. I know it's kind of long, but I was trying to do a principle here. Let's apply this to the towers, okay? We know, again, that the lower part of the World Trade Center towers, the lower part could support at least twice the weight of that upper block. Okay, and it was actually designed to handle almost up to 5 times its dead weight, okay? Because the day this happened, it wasn't fully loaded, there was no wind forces on it virtually, and it was just its own dead weight. Certainly, the lower portion of the tower could support the upper block. It did for an hour and a half. So if the columns supporting the upper floors gave way, that is, the columns in the area where the fire were, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's say that they got all heated up simultaneously and they started weakening, and they could no longer support the upper block of floors. Okay, that upper block would obviously begin to accelerate downward at some rate of acceleration. But when the upper block came into contact with a lower undamaged structure that was not on fire and people were walking down that could support the weight of the upper block and a lot more, then the upward force, the resistive force on the falling top block, would immediately change the rate of acceleration, and it would break it or smash it. It would have to have and to break it or smash it would have to have a negative acceleration or a deceleration or a jolt. But the problem is there was no jolt measured, and therefore there was no upward force that was greater than the weight of the upper block when it was just at rest. So the upper block of the Twin Towers were measured, and they never, ever decelerated. Tony Zambodi did this, and David Chandler did it. They always accelerated, and therefore they could not have smashed or crushed the lower floors of the tower because there was no deceleration or G-force to amplify the force on the structure. And that's a fundamental problem, and NIST never addressed this problem.
Now, we had David Chandler on here, and he said it the same way, his way. He said, to gain a force, you must lose momentum. Period. And for our audience listening, we're talking about 9/11 truth, and we're talking about Newton's laws, basic laws. You don't need a big degree. You don't have to go to graduate school to understand any of this. This is some of the basic principles of science and physics that we're talking about here. And also for our audience, again, we want to expose the pile driver theory, which is what NIST has founded their entire 9/11 theories really on. And the pile driver theory says that the lower block, it simply bypasses Newton's laws, and it's recruiting now, right? The pile driver claims that as the block is coming down, as Dave Thomas says it's literally recruiting other blocks of buildings on its side. And I made the example last week when Andy and I were talking. That's like a little sports car running into a big truck head on, and then the notion that somehow the little car is somehow at the point of impact recruiting sections of the bigger truck, and is thus not sustaining any damage, or the little car is going to win because it's recruiting parts of the big truck somehow instead of sustaining the impact and decelerating and transferring that force. So
that's right. And there's a lot of other problems with the pile driver. If I could, sorry to interrupt you there. There's a bunch of problems in addition to that. First of all, like we just said, the upper block never slowed down and never decelerated. Therefore, it couldn't have applied any force greater than its static weight. The second problem with it is that Newton's third law says that for every action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. Any smaller block falling on the larger block would have destroyed itself because the two forces are equal, and the upper block, remember, is built of thinner steel than the lower block. So any force on the lower block is also imposed on the upper block, and David Chandler points this out. It would have destroyed the upper block, and there couldn't have smashed itself all the way down to the bottom. And Professor Bazant said it did survive all the way to the bottom, and then it crushed itself back up. I don't know how it could have survived.
Amazingly. And a lot of people use the word inertia. I've got a friend who just believes the official story, and he says inertia. And they kind of use that word, in some new context. Amazing stuff. Now, for the sake of time, Jonathan, we want to, I know you've got a lot of other work we want to touch on. So any last thoughts on the NIST experiments that you want to recap or say anything else before we go on to some of your other work?
Yeah, I think just that when Dave Thomas or anybody else out there thinks they have this scenario about how this system crushes all the way to the ground, my response on almost all at the end of my videos, almost at the end of all of my videos, are, I don't mind being proved wrong. I've been wrong before in my life, and I might be wrong. But if you're going to show me that I'm wrong, demonstrate that I'm wrong, and do it through experiment using the experimental method. Prove me wrong. Just
Absolutely.
to say I'm wrong or to say everybody's wrong doesn't cut it with me. And all the models and equations out there, they're powerful and they're helpful, but if it doesn't match what we see, observe in real life, it doesn't matter about those equations. So I think they should prove it. They should set up some sort of principle system. They don't have to build a whole big tower, but just show us how this principle works, and it would sure help clarify things.
Absolutely. Experiments, not words. We want to cover a couple more topics. One is maybe you can tell us a little bit about the Jonathan with regard to your great Thermite debate, which you kind of already talked about it a little bit. Feel free to talk about that, and then we're going to ask you about your film, the one that's Expert versus Expert, which we highly recommend people watch. Which one you want to tackle first? You want to tell us a little bit about the great Thermite debate and why you did that experiment?
Sure. Yeah, that experiment there was based upon actually watching a TV show. I think that was also the BBC too. Prior to this, of course, a lot of the greats out there, Stephen Jones and others, found in the dust, of course, this thermitic material, nanothermite. I'm sure you've talked about that on the show.
Right.
Now, if that's not a smoking gun, if that's not the gun, I don't know what else. What is that stuff doing at ground zero? A high-tech nanotechnology, something invented in Lawrence Livermore Lab. That should not be at ground zero. I mean, that to me is like, that's the key to the whole, it's one of the keys to the whole thing. But anyhow.
And let me jump in, and for the audience sake, again, the official story and the defense on this is that the stuff that we're talking about, the military-grade thermite that was found, and the sulfur and the granules, which we can get into all that here. I'll let you talk about that. The official story, essentially, in NIST, claims that these items just came together just randomly. Like, I don't know if you want to hit on that, but that's what we're talking about, people. This is evidence versus theories, and the theories that they have is that these items simply came together, and not only with gypsum dry board and all this stuff, but just random. You want to pick up on that and just?
Yeah, I think what they're saying, which is again totally ridiculous. They're saying, well, the aluminum in the plane combined with the iron oxide of the steel and just sort of made this stuff. Well, first of all, that's impossible because it defies what we call the law of entropy. You can't take the ingredients of a wedding cake and heave it into a campfire and expect a wedding cake to come popping out of it because it defies the law of entropy. And so to say that these materials from the plane and the steel and just kind of made itself into little nanoparticles and nanotechnology, something that was just invented 10 years before, defies the second law of thermodynamics or the law of entropy. So it's absolutely ridiculous to come up with a statement like that, unless you just don't know any better. But you can't organize something into a more organized state from just throwing things together. So,
no, I was going to say that's amazing, and that goes right along. Well, we talked last week with the sound thresholds. This thing goes on and on and on with this 9/11. People that want to defend the official story, the stories that are injected to explain, to get around the science, is just amazing. And people out there may be laughing, those that understand 9/11 truth, but some people take this serious, and they really believe that these items just randomly came together. They choose to ignore the missing jolt, they ignore the sound thresholds, and stuff goes on and on. So, but go on, please. So you're talking about the go on about the thermate, the great thermate
right.
debate.
Sure. So Professor Jones again and others, they found this. There was, of course, about the whole paper written about the nanothermite, and they also noticed they were trying to tie in that where did the sulfur come from the steel, the sulfidation of steel that Jonathan Barnett found. And the theory that they came together, they throw all this evidence on a table and they kind of come up with a theory. Their theory is that, hey, you know what, we think that some types of thermite were used out here, or thermite were used out here, and some derivative of thermite, which is thermate, which does have sulfur in it, which will produce a eutectic formation. So the combination of molten steel being found out there, the combination of finding this eutectic, as well as the actual nanothermite itself, really lends itself to having some thermite out there that was used as part of the demolition. So the mainstream media gets on the case, and they put together a TV show, and they do an experiment, and which is good for them. They did an experiment, and they took some they took some material. They took some thermite. Thermite is a mix of iron oxide and aluminum. And they mixed it, and they were, I believe, in New Mexico Tech, and they took some loose thermite, and they made a column, a steel column, and they made this conical steel funnel, if you will, to hold the thermite against the column, 175 pounds. They lit it, and they basically, once they lit it, it didn't really do any damage at all to the column. And therefore, they made the conclusion, they jumped to the conclusion, well, if it won't melt this column, how on earth could you melt much larger columns in the World Trade Center? And therefore, all this nonsense about thermite being found out there must be to no avail because it obviously doesn't do anything. Well, I remember seeing that. That movie, and I thought, that's strange because I'm certainly no expert on thermite either. I don't know much about it, but I did realize that the stuff burns rather hot, and I know they used it for welding railroad tracks, so I know it can melt steel. And so I thought to myself, I said, how can I see if this stuff will actually melt steel or cut a vertical column? And by the way, other debunking sites had said out there, well, this stuff couldn't have been used at all because there's no way to contain it and hold it to cut a vertical column. So I started setting this up, and I ordered this stuff online and mixed it together and read the book on how to do it, and it's very easy, straightforward. Mix the chemicals up, and I just wanted to use small quantities because, again, I'm no expert on this stuff, and I didn't want to just destroy too much stuff. So I mixed it up and I put it around a steel column, and then my first problem, as I say in the video, was figuring out what can hold something that can melt steel. And I thought, well, maybe I can use some roof tile. Ceramics can go pretty hot. And I put 10 pounds of it around a joint and lit it, and you can see on the video it didn't do anything. So I basically just continued and thought of other ways to hold this stuff against a column, and made a very, very crude, what I call a piece of box steel that I had milled. I call it my thermitic box cutter, and put some thermite in there, and son of a gun, when I lit that, it sure did cut steel. It cut it pretty well. It melted it and it cut it. So I did it with bolts, and I did it with other things too, but the whole point was to prove that, yes, indeed, thermite can melt and cut steel.
And for our audience, again, now, to kind of reviewing, so I believe it was the BBC that put that experiment together, or
yeah, I think it was.
Essentially, these elements of the mainstream media, the BBC, they go out and roll up, I guess, the sleeves somewhat, and try to put together this hoaxy experiment, and that seems to be what triggered this. It sparked some nerves here in the mind of Jonathan Cole, and he rolls up his sleeves. And sure enough, that seems to have been what inspired that great Thermite debate video, which is amazing. I've watched it. Cuts right through. End of story. You proved it in that experiment. So there you go. And that is why the 9/11 Truth Movement is based on experiments and action, not on words, as some of the opposition has committed to. Now, obviously, we're running out of time. Tell us a little bit now. This video, the expert versus expert. It's an amazing video. It's an ironic video. I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but it is well made, and it really drives home the point of where we are. And maybe you can wrap up and tell us just where you think we are in this 9/11 Truth Movement. Tell us a little bit about expert versus expert, and kind of recap, telling us where you think we are now and where we're headed.
Sure, yeah. And just to make a correction what I said before, actually it was the National Geographic that did the experiment. It was both.
Okay, and the National Geographic, okay.
Okay, so Expert versus Expert's my latest video I put out, and what this video is really about is just showing what we, the American people, have been told over the last 10 or 11 years as to why those towers came down. And what we were told varied depending upon when we watched it and who we watched. NIST, never really told us how those towers came down at all. They stopped at collapse initiation. So we rely on our mainstream media and other reports, but mostly our mainstream media. There was NOVA programs that told us what happened, BBC programs, National Geographic programs, and we look at what they told us over the years, and we see that what they told us completely contradicts themselves as time evolved. So you can watch the video, but first we were told, we all heard about the explosions that day. The first story we were told about the steel melted, and that's what made it come down. But then we realized that, well, wait a minute, steel can't melt from ordinary office fire, so that can't be true. And then we were told on one TV program, I think it was the NOVA program, that the columns broke out, and they were told about the pancake collapse where the trusses broke free. Later on, NIST said, no, it really wasn't that. That really was not what happened. Just the opposite happened. The truss connections held, and it pulled the columns in. So they kind of discredited the pancake theory, which was kind of like the main theory in the early years. And then all the way up to today, I think in 2011, we actually came up with a new theory, even after NIST produced all their reports, and that was this concept that the aluminum in the planes melted, and then when the sprinkler or the water hit it, then the aluminum exploded. That's the latest theory that we heard from, I believe, a scientist over in Europe. So we have all these conflicting ideas and concepts, but nobody has ever proved it, and most of them conflict with each other. And you would think with the largest disaster, the largest mass murder in America, we would have the answers, and the largest structural failures, and yet everybody ignores the obvious. And the obvious, of course, that meets all the evidence is that it was some type of controlled demolition. And so what I just try to do is demonstrate what one expert said versus another expert. That's kind of the whole thrust of it.
And it's a great video. It's amazing. I guess when you're making up and you're moving the goalposts as you go along, you have to have a lot of change. But it's not the kind of change that our nation needs and humanity is looking for right now. It's a different type of change. They simply change the rules. They change the goalposts. They move the bases around, whatever it takes to keep the story going and going and going. And that's why we do what we do, Jonathan. And Andy, you got any questions for Jonathan Cole, our guest? Any other thoughts before we wrap up? We've got about 5 minutes left.
Sure. I've been taking advantage of this opportunity to listen to him speak here. I guess as our last question, you raised a point in one of your videos, and I want you to address it briefly on this program, is, the difference that we would see if 9/11 were investigated as a crime instead of an act of war. Can you go into that a little bit?
Sure can. It's interesting, again, now here we have the largest mass murder on U.S. soil, and if you steal a candy bar from a store, that's a crime. Here we have the largest mass murder, and it was never considered a crime. And when I ask the audience to raise their hand, who thinks it's a crime, everybody raises their hand. Of course it's a crime. But our government did not consider it a crime. Why didn't they consider it as a crime? Well, my opinion is the reason they didn't consider it as a crime is because in a crime, you secure the crime scene, you look at all the evidence, and you have investigations into it. Well, they did just the opposite. They did not secure the crime scene. They removed the steel just as rapidly as they could, and they didn't want to have any investigation whatsoever. In fact, they didn't have any investigation for well over a year after this. Well, there's a reason they didn't want to do this. Because if they do this and they had a real criminal investigation where the smallest of evidence, a little speck of DNA, can completely overturn what the conclusion is, if they really had a real and treated this as a real crime scene, I don't think they would come up, I'm sure they would not come up with the same culprits that were blamed for the crime itself. And so the goal was not to consider it as a crime, and that's exactly what they didn't. That's exactly what they did. They did not consider it a crime. That's my opinion.
That is well said, Jonathan Cole, and I agree. I think we both agree here that this whole thing has been treated with so much negligence. We're trying to get other guests on the show. Andy and I have been talking about the NFPA 921 and how that fire essentially the safety manual that applies to fire handlings throughout the country, how that was ignored, even with NIST being a contributor, as I understand it, to that manual. Just everything was ignored. A lot of people point out in the new Experts Speak Out video by architects and engineers, some of the experts talk about this, how the cleanup job itself was an act of a criminal act. No one seemed to want to investigate this if it were not for the New Jersey girls and for a lot of people and the victims, the families pushing for this. We do appreciate our guest today, Jonathan. We do sincerely, from the bottom of our hearts, we appreciate you coming on this show today and sharing all this information. We have so much on the table. We could probably speak to you for another hour or two, and I'm sure you would have a lot of good knowledge to share with us and our audience. But unfortunately, we are out of time. We're going to continue this battle here at 9/11 Freefall. Andy, any last comments for our audience today?
Well, just keep on tuning in and reach out. Bring this information to as many people as possible. And, if you're looking for somebody to change the world, then you need to look in the mirror because it falls on your shoulders and all of our shoulders, too.
Amazing. Always good at good, solid, short points. So thanks a lot, Andy. I appreciate it. And our audience, this is Bernie Suarez with Andy Steele saying goodbye. And this is 9/11 Freefall. Keep marching on. This is a big battle for truth that we have. Take care.